Okay, I'd like to call the Planning and Works Committee meeting to order, please. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to, we do have a couple delegations and members of the public here, so welcome to one and all. I'll ask if there's any declarations of pecuniary interest on any of the P&W matters. Seeing none. Okay, there are two delegations. We'll do the delegations first, and they're related agenda items. And the first of those is Jeff Steger from the Federation of Agriculture, and this has to do with item 4.2, I think, on the agenda. Jeff, welcome.
Well, thank you for that welcome, Your Worship. Congratulations on being elected this term of office to all elected people. Hope the next year, 4 years, is full of successes and well-managed challenges. And with that, I'll start my presentation on behalf of the Federation of Agriculture. We start off with, there's three items. The census bulletin, which is really the best thing going for us here. And also then the one-pager about some issues, and finally the Real Dirt on Farming, great book. If you want to know anything about agriculture in 2 seconds, just check that one out. Let's start with the census data. There's 4 pages, and just to go through this somewhat quickly, and thanks to the Regional Waterloo Planning Department for putting this together. On the first page of the census bulletin, it talks about the number of farms headquartered in the Waterloo region. And you see there we've dropped slightly, but we're still at 1,374 farms in the Waterloo region. And you can see from your municipalities, where your home municipality is, how many people are how many farmers are in your jurisdiction. If we were to go over one page over, we'll look at the average size of farms in the Waterloo region. So between the 70 and 129 acre ranges is where predominantly our farms are. For Canada, it's about 800 acres, but that includes those very large farms out in the prairies. So we're below the average for Canada, but typical for our area in Ontario. Just have a quick look above that chart. It says the average age of farm operators. We're pretty lucky in the region of Waterloo, even though our numbers are dropping. There's two good parts of the news of that. It's not dropping as fast as the rest of Ontario, Canada. And the average age of our farm operators is actually less than the average age for Ontario, which indicates a certain level of vitality. If new people coming into the business, that suggests it has a future. So that's kind of a good thing there. On the next page, page 3, is the farm types. And cattle ranching and farming is a big part of our agriculture here in the Waterloo region. We don't do crops, we don't do like fruits and vegetables so well, although it's quite amazing what they can do with greenhouses and other new varieties to try to grow some of these. We're not going to grow bananas yet, I don't think, unless you really want to, because as farmers we can do anything you want. It just says how much do you want to pay for it. The tech part is easy. We can do whatever you like. It's just you have to say what it is you like. On the last page then, this is the receipts and expenses for Waterloo region. $563 million worth of receipts, and it costs $483 million to do that. So for every, so it's a very big part of our economy in the Waterloo region, an important part. It's changing. We're seeing lots of more small commodity, boutique type operations with community shared agricultures and those type of farm market opportunities. So that's kind of nice to see that. We have a few issues. These are just broad bases on the one-page handout. You know, where some of these are 6 things we're concerned about. Infrastructure, we'd like to see rural internet, high-speed natural gas in the countryside, all-day train service on Highway 7. We're always concerned about our rural institutions like schools and hospitals and libraries. Consolidation means sometimes these things close, so that's a concern. In the Waterloo region, probably not a big a deal. Large body that is the school board, so they seem to do the best they can. Hard to find labor. There's probably 2 job openings for every graduate in agriculture. But if you got a young person who wants to head and decide what they want to do, take them to some of the farm trade shows. You'll see some technology there that's quite amazing, all the way from drones to AI and analyzing large databases of information, that type of thing. We're always looking to create more investment and job growth for our farms, and that includes building affordable communities with good planning. And we're very proud that we continue to secure a sustainable food production system on behalf of the citizens of Ontario. And so with that, I'll look for any questions, but before I forget, this is a great booklet here. Once again, I'd like to just say that you can see in there that the headlines, some of the stuff you see in the papers, in the press about agriculture, including humane treatment of animals, GMO crops, pesticides, all that kind of stuff. This is a really great resource. I encourage you, after you've done council, been a busy day, and you want to do some recreational reading, you're obviously going to want to take this back. I'm sorry I don't have any bookmarks for you, but it's a great document. I don't want to make it less than it is. It's great. So that's my presentation, Your Worship. Thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I'll try my best to answer them. But we're glad to be part of agriculture in the Waterloo region.
Well, thanks very much, Jeff, and we always appreciate the Federation coming in and giving us this information and the support that the Federation has provided to a number of projects, including the LRT. Are there any questions of Mr. Steger? Chair Redmond.
Thank you very much for coming. This is such an important piece of who we are as a region. You sort of referenced it a little bit in passing. Can you speak a little bit more about the high-tech support for modern farming?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's pretty impressive. So I mentioned the drones. So drone technology is one where you can map out the field and see where the crop stressors are, what kind of mitigation you can do, whether it's fertilizer and the like. Robots, that's the next amazing thing. Like they're proposing in some test models where the robot actually walks up and down the rows of corn, walks all day, and picks the bugs off and squishes them or whatever there's going to be, the fate is. There you go. No pesticides. What a great, now the issue, of course, that'll happen is the technology to build those robots at that size. That's just a matter of time, isn't it? Like we've all seen technology. I mentioned also AI, that's artificial intelligence is applied to large databases. We try to identify trends with huge pools of information, and those databases are being assembled. So if you're an analyst skilled in that type of database query, then there's opportunities for you there. There's just so much going on. The new CRISPR technology, although controversial, is the next step up from what's been called GMO technology, and that promises pretty significant the opportunity to really change the characteristics of food and animals to not have for all kinds of purposes.
I think it's really exciting.
Yes.
During the campaign, I talked to a third-generation farmer who has organically grown bison on her farm, and she was talking about a water trough that is solar-powered but motion-activated. So when it's dry until the animals come up, and then it fills up with water, and then it recedes, and it retards the fungus that grows in standing water. And because they're organic, they can avoid using antibiotics and stuff. And I thought, what a really high-tech answer to sort of a low-tech problem. I think it's pretty exciting, that convergence that's happening.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That's a lot of fun there for people who like to tinker or just play and try some of these new things. There's actually business opportunity. I sure appreciate you mentioning that. There's a ton of those little projects like that people can do, and it's all the way from solar panels, as you mentioned. Motion activated, that's a good one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, Jeff, thanks very much. There's no more questions, but thanks very much for coming in.
All right, thank you.
Okay. The next delegation is Craig Robson. Mr. Robson, this is on the Brownfield financial incentive report.
Thank you, Chair Galloway, members of committee. It's always a hard act to follow my first cousin, Jeff. He was in the same class as me at grade 1, and he got all the smarts. My name is Craig Robson. I'm here to speak to agenda item 5.1, which is the review of the Regional Brownfield Incentive Program, known as BFIP. My first point was originally intended to be my third point, until I ran through the speech and realized that 10 minutes is going to be tough. So I thought I'd better bring this one forward first. This is the one I hope we don't need, but in the event that staff's report is followed, I think we have to really look carefully at some of the transition provisions in the staff report. I'd like to point out, and as you're all probably aware, but sort of to emphasize, the BFIP program has been with us since 2006. It's not a new program. According to the report and my experience in working with it, it is working very, very well. But one of the problems with the brownfield remediation and development charge credits and allowances is bylaws only last for 5 years. Remediation sites typically last for much longer than that. Many of the remediation sites span more than 2 bylaw periods. We act on behalf of the owner of the Frame Bud site, and it's about to enter into its 3rd bylaw period with the new bylaw that's coming in this summer. A related point, I submitted a letter as a handout. This is a letter I sent to regional staff in early February to discuss the brownfield credit program and redevelopment allowances, but the main thrust of the letter was to discuss the development process and the absolute need for certainty for developers who are going to get into this very, very financially dangerous and uncertain type of work. And I would request respectfully that after you finish reading Jeff's stuff, I'm sure you'll still be awake after. You should read his first, then you'll still be awake. Then read mine. Don't read mine first. It could be disastrous. Staff notes in their report that there's no guarantee of program funding. I agree, there is no guarantee of program funding. But ongoing sites that are underway or under offer, that are brownfield sites that were potentially erroneously anticipating that these allowances and credits would remain in place, I think should be guaranteed lots of notice for such significant program changes, so as to have time to qualify for those changes or for stay under their existing program before the changes come in, and to be able to obtain the credits and allowances that they had budgeted for when they made that very crucial decision to even acquire the site 5, 6, or in the case of the Frame Bud people, 8, 9, 10 years ago. Having this program get so dramatically changed within 3 months, or being given notice of it 3 months, 4 months before the bylaw, is not encouraging developers to take on risky remediation projects if the programs that were there at the outset can disappear almost in an instant. The staff report is, with respect, unclear, or perhaps I'm not reading it well. I can't figure out if approved applications for RDC exemptions, those that are approved now or by the end of this bylaw period, will qualify to be processed under the current bylaw provisions. That needs to be clarified. And with all due respect, I would hope that the answer is they will be. What is clear is that if you aren't approved by the end of this bylaw period, the RDC exemption drops to a maximum of $1 million with no soft cost factor. With greatest of respect, $1 million ain't what it used to be, and it isn't very much when it comes to cleaning up a site. That might pay the engineers and some of the moving of the dirt. One of our clients is eligible for cleanup costs, and they've been approved, of over $8 million, and is almost ready to go to permits, almost meaning sometime this year. The application for RDC exemption has been in for months. It's not yet finalized. But if his project doesn't qualify to remain under the current bylaw, he will lose $7 million worth of TIG exemption. That's a kick in the teeth. Neither period is long enough. The TIG program is you have to have your final application approved by September. I think it's very, very onerous to have so little transition time when you're moving away from a long-standing program that is working so well. In addition, the phase-out provisions are unclear. It's not clear what trigger events qualifies a project for the 100% recovery limited to $1 million in 2019, 20, and 21. Neither is it clear that if you qualify in 2020 for the 100% recovery, does that continue into 2022 and 23 as building permits are issued? That needs to be clarified as well. So my request, should I fail in my main request, is to provide more time for the exemption applications and TIG applications to be complete. We need to clarify what is the cutoff date. I would respectfully request some further industry discussion about how long it takes to get approved. And at the very least, we need until, I would say, to the end of 2019 to get these projects approved. I don't see that there's a blinding urgency to take a program of the last 13 and 14 years and just essentially kill it, in a 3-month period. That's, with respect, could be perceived as unfair to people that got into the game on the reasonable expectation there would be some kind of grandfathering or reasonable notice. We need to clarify those trigger events. So back to the hopeful stage of the presentation. As noted in the staff report, the RDC program is working very, very well. But the staff report also makes it sound like the industry has everything figured out and there's no issues in remediating brownfield sites and getting financing, and it's all just business as usual, not a big problem. I'm involved in quite a number of brownfield remediation sites, and with the greatest of respect, I disagree. What the industry has figured out is, and some municipalities have some experience with this, there's absolutely no way of knowing how much it's going to cost to remediate a site until it's over. Actual costs can and often are millions of dollars more than the estimate. Financing is not straightforward and it's difficult to obtain, and you have to have deep pockets to do this sort of development because you're pretty much upfronting the initial remediation costs out of ability to raise your own money. They also have a lot more guts than I do. If I had enough money to do it, I'd be hiding somewhere in Bahamas. I wouldn't be doing this, what they do. That's scary. The value of the current BFIP program is clearly set out on page 4 of the staff report. The summary, there's $750 million in new assessment at a cost to the taxpayer of $11,700,000 in exemptions and grants. There's also $26,000 or $26 million worth of TIG payments, but I characterize those differently. Those come from taxes indirectly that wouldn't otherwise have been obtained but for the remediation. That is not direct taxpayer dollars, it's taxes from the site. Seems like the region has done a very, very good investment for their $11,700,000. I'd like to quote a couple of sentences from the staff report. They wrote it better than I can. This is from page 4 of the report. This investment is anticipated to result in over 2,500 new residential units, over 1 million square feet of new non-residential floor area, and over $750 million in increased assessment value. On average, assessment values across approved brownfield sites are estimated to be more than 3,000% higher than pre-remediation and redevelopment. Estimates also indicate that for every dollar of incentive provided, $20 of increased assessment results. After reading that, I thought that they were going to wholeheartedly endorse keeping it. Why would you screw with something that's working so well, was my kind of 4 o'clock in this morning rewriting of my notes comment. TIG agreements are appreciated. I mean, don't get me wrong, they're appreciated, but there's issues with them. They're completely discretionary, so when you start a new project and you go in to see staff and ask them, what do you think? Could we maybe get a TIG for this? And staff are excellent. They give you an honest response. You have confidence in the response, but it ain't over till we come see you guys. So you're never quite sure. Lower tier municipalities can pull out of the program, which would mean probably no TIG for that local municipality. The DC exemption, on the other hand, is not tied to the wishes of a local municipality. That's a regional decision that goes on its own. The present value of a TIG, it sounds good, oh, we'll give you all your money back. And that is good. I mean, I don't want to depreciate that, but I do have to point out that the present value of a TIG is probably 50% of the money spent. You spend all the money at the outset getting it cleaned up, and that's when it's tough to get the financing. Then you have to go through the normal development process of approval, site plan, zonings, OP, which some of that can be done concurrently, but you still have to build the whole site out. Then you have to get MPAC to assess the site. I think MPAC and MOE share the same building or perhaps the same stenographer, I'm not sure, but they take a while. Then you have to have 1 full year of taxes received so that there's money in the kitty to pay. Then you start to get your payments, and up to 10 years to get the money back with no interest factor. That's not a great return. So it's better than nothing, for sure, but it isn't, don't think that it's, oh, you're getting all of your money back. You're certainly not. The RDC exemption, on the other hand, is much more immediate. Its present value is much, much higher because you get that at building permit, which is far, years before the TIG program starts to kick in, and it's basically a one-shot. You get it at the time, and then it's over. So I'm strenuously requesting the reconsideration of this capping and elimination of the exemption over time. And if it is capped, then we need more certainty about the ability to get TIG agreements, because that is uncertain. On discussion, my last discussion point is the loss of soft costs. I'm not even going to talk about the Phase 2 $40,000 because in all honesty, when our clients are looking at that, they go, yeah, that's nice, let's move on to the real money. That's not the $40,000, it's fine. They don't care as much as I would. But it's the soft costs. There's lots of soft costs in contaminated sites. You have to do all sorts of analysis, all sorts of report. You send these things off to the Ministry of the Environment, and then you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And you pay for a lot of things that you don't have to do when you're doing a clean site. The TIG agreement monies come out of taxes indirectly that would otherwise not be obtained but for the remediation of the site. And the present value of a TIG is already significantly impaired, and I'm respectfully requesting that it not be impaired further by getting rid of the 10% soft costs. And if the RDC exemption remains, I would also respectfully request that the 10% soft costs also apply to that. I've always liked the fact that you got 20, but I never quite understood why it was 10 for TIG and 20 for brownfields, and I don't want to over-ask. But at the very least, I think there should be soft costs included, because those costs hurt just as much as the digging and the moving costs. So those, with respect, are my submissions. I'm happy to try to answer any questions if you have any.
Okay, thanks very much, Mr. Robson. Any questions to Mr. Robson? We do have another delegation on this, and then staff will be, not a presentation, but there'll be some discussion. Councillor or Chair Redmond?
Thank you, Chair Galloway. Through you to Mr. Robson. I was going to ask, but I think you've kind of fleshed out some of the delay between purchasing a property and applying for the TIG and the RDC exemption. Have you developed brownfield sites or been party to ones in other jurisdictions? I'm wondering if you can compare our TIG as it stands now, the modifications that staff are recommending, and how that would stack up against other jurisdictions that had similar programs.
Only in Guelph. Sometimes I pause there and say that's enough, but no. Guelph's program, I think ostensibly they have one, but I don't think it works very well. So I haven't been involved in a lot of brownfields in Guelph. And it's only in Kitchener, Waterloo, and Cambridge that I have been involved extensively in the brownfields. I think that both programs are, I think, innovative, unique, revolutionary, excellent, and needed. And the fact that other municipalities may not have actually figured that out yet is to their peril. Perhaps we have a little more brownfields to clean up because of our industrial heritage. But the fact that others aren't doing it very well, and I don't know what's happening beyond Brampton, because I just refuse to do that stuff down there. But this program, both programs are, I think, good programs. I think they should be continued, but you're doing better than everybody else already.
And I guess one of the things I hear you say loud and clear is you don't like the $1 million cap that's proposed. If we were looking at capping it in any way, do you have a threshold that you think is more reasonable than $1 million?
I have to say the cost of cleanup. Now, obviously, anything more than $1 million would be welcome, And perhaps if there is an active TIG involved, that could give grounds to have some limitation so that at some point you get a certain amount back in that and you get a certain amount on the TIG. The strong preference would be to leave it as it is, because even with the brownfields credits, it's a very, very risky venture to go into this stuff. And a lot of the sites now that we're working on are almost, all of them seem to have contamination. And so there's fewer and fewer people that are good at that know what they're doing and have the pockets to deal with it. And so I think it's a growing problem, and I really would like to see what you've got now stay in place with, the 10% soft cost.
Through this review process, one of the things that came to my attention that was news to me was that the province also, I believe, has a TIG, and you could go and get relief from school board taxes. Were you aware of that, and have you ever tried to access that on behalf of your clients?
We are exploring that for the first time on a project that we're dealing with in Waterloo. We don't have an answer yet on it. We're hopeful that that will provide some assistance and certainly would avail ourselves of it if it's available. And that would then, I think, have to be credited against our other recoveries. We can't double dip. So,
Thank you.
Councillor Strickland?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you to Mr. Robson. Thanks so much for coming in today and sharing some of your concerns with the proposed changes. I'm just wondering, through the development of the report, staff entertained some industry consultations. Were you and or your clients consulted on the report?
some of my clients were, but I guess I've not been in it long enough to be consulted, so I wasn't invited.
Did your clients express similar views to staff as you've expressed today?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Urbanovic?
Through you, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Robson, thanks for coming in and for being so direct with your comments, because I think they are very helpful to me. In your opinion, from the people that you've talked to in the industry who do clean up these kinds of sites, do you feel that the changes that are proposed are likely to see us seeing less of these sites be cleaned up in our community going forward?
That's my belief, because some of them are marginal. I don't see the clients' numbers, but that's what I hear, and that's what I expect. I think eventually everything will get developed over time because we're running out of dirt. But I think you're going to see significant delays. I think you're going to see people not doing deals because they don't have this coming in, and they'll just say, no, I can't do this one. I'm going to go find a clean site in Wellesley or something to work on. I think as well, the uncertainty of it all is going to winnow out more and more people who just say, I can't take a chance on this. One of the projects that I'm speaking of today is currently down, if this goes through, they are down $18 million in expected regional development charge credits that they expected to get. That's tough. That could be the end of somebody that doesn't have pockets.
And I suppose that could also result in projects that maybe have started in some way actually grinding to a halt and sitting there, quite frankly.
I think it could happen that way. What the danger I see is if a rookie gets involved, like if I was dumb enough to think I could do that stuff, when you run out of money, you run out of money. And these are not exactly, lenders aren't falling all over each other to land on contaminated sites that aren't yet cleaned up with an unknown cost to clean up, with no potential safety net.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Robson. The next delegation
you.
is Glenn Scheels. Mr. Scheels. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you, Chair Galloway and members of committee. I'm here today on behalf of one of my colleagues who's working on brownfield applications for Auburn Developments on a couple of their projects here in Kitchener. Unfortunately, she's double booked today, so I'm standing in. So please bear with me on that. My comments, I came in a little late, I apologize. Made a trip to the dentist first thing this morning. I heard most of Mr. Robson's presentation, and I concur with the comments that I heard. These are really valuable programs and Craig quoted some of the findings from the staff report, and they're certainly valuable programs that I think have had a great and positive impact and should be continued. With respect to Auburn, they've done a number of projects in our community, the barrel yards, aero lofts, and right now we're working with them to tackle their largest and newest project, and that is the redevelopment of the former Schneider's plant in Kitchener, which is certainly a major undertaking. They acquired that property in 2017, and we're still working on formulating our various planning applications and our brownfield applications. As you can appreciate, with a project of that scale, there's been a lot of work to do. So it's a sizable project. It's over 20 acres on the main block. Demolition has taken place. That took a year in itself. The planning applications are about to go in. The site does have contamination. That's no surprise, given its industrial past. Our Phase 1 ESA is complete. Our Phase 2 ESA is nearly complete. And the RSC process is well underway, but that's going to take some time. Auburn has applied for the TIG program. That application was made in January of 2019. But there's still some work to be completed before that application is fully accepted. The Phase 2 report has to be completed, and hopefully we can get that in place by September. Auburn will be applying for the RDC program, but the application requirements require that we can't do that until the record of site condition, the RSC, is complete. And so that, as I said, is underway, but that takes some time. So we're caught in this transition here right now. The site obviously is going to take some time to build out, and in fact, it's probably, once started, will be well over 10 years to complete. So this is a big undertaking. It's a long-term project, and these brownfield incentive programs were certainly very important in Auburn's redevelopment program here. And when doing their due diligence back in 2017, obviously they were in place, and they would like them to continue as well because it has a significant assistance in making this program, or the development program, I should say, come to realization. And especially the RDC program, because as Mr. Robson pointed out, it's the present value of money that's really important here. So we're caught in a transition period here. As I said, we'll work to get the TIG application in place by September, but we're very concerned about the loss of the RDC exemption program. We haven't been able to file that application because of the requirements, so we would like that program to continue. Or if it doesn't continue, could we have some kind of exemption or a better transition program? That's certainly our request to you today. We're also concerned regarding the proposed 1 million cap on the RDC exemption. And again, the 1 million figure, according to the report, is based on, the average amounts that have been used for the various sites, but not all sites are created equal. And this is a very big site, and similar to Mr. Robson's site, the bigger sites obviously have got bigger cleanup budgets. So this one is going to be much more than $1 million in cleanup cost, and we would like, obviously, to be able to avail ourselves to a bigger program than that. Auburn is also concerned regarding the elimination of the 20% indirect costs to the RDC program, and those costs are significant and a big part of realizing the program. So to summarize, again, I concur with the comments that Craig made to you this morning. I think he's summarized very well the concerns that Auburn has, and indeed I think the industry has in general. We don't support the recommendations as they're drafted, And we would like some more time to be able to work through some of these things and come up with a program that would be beneficial to the Schneider site as per the current programs that the region has in place. So those are my comments, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Glenn. Yes, there's a couple. Councillor Jaworski.
Thank you, through the chair. Thanks for coming out today, Glenn, and giving us the information on the Schneider site. One of the things that you brought up and was brought up by Mr. Robson was about the capping. It really seems to be problematic based on the size of site. Yeah. I'm just thinking through this right now that maybe a capping per acre would be more appropriate. Is that the kind of thing would work? And of course, I think we need input from staff and from people like you, but just thinking through this, is that part of the problem?
Again, I think I'd echo Craig's comments. Certainly, I think our preference would be no cap, but if you were going to cap, then yes, maybe have it scalable so that, small sites and large sites obviously have got different requirements.
And Mr. Robson was really differentiating between development charge exemptions and TIGs, tax increment grants. Do you have the same sort of differentiation between the two, or you just like more time to work this out?
Just more time, I think, in general, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Councillor Verbanovic.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Mr. Scheels, for coming in today. And I have two questions. The first one is going to be a similar one to that asked by Chair Redmond earlier, because I know you have experience in other communities. And I'm just wondering if you have a sense of how our program compares to that in other communities, and what our successes have been in relation to other communities.
I certainly do a lot of work in other communities, but I have to admit I am not familiar with the brownfield programs in the other communities as compared to ours, so I can't really provide you any guidance on that one. And certainly in terms of the successes, I think we've seen a lot of projects in our communities across Waterloo and Kitchener, and even in the Galt part of Cambridge and some of the older industrial fabric. As Craig indicated, we have had an strong industrial history. A lot of our redevelopment and intensification success has come on those older and former industrial properties. And there are still more in our developed area, the areas that we do want to see change. The Schneider's property, for example, is not going to be the last one down in that Rockway area that's going to require some assistance to transform that area along the LRT system into a new, vibrant, mixed-use neighborhood. There's going to be lots of other places for application.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Glenn.
Thank you.
And are there any further delegations that wanted to speak to this particular matter? Then I'll turn it over to Michelle. Michelle's going to highlight the report.
Thank you, Chair Galloway. The report before you deals with the Brownfield Financial Incentive Review and provides recommendations for consideration by committee. The purpose of the goal of the Brownfields Financial Incentive Program is to encourage remediation, redevelopment of brownfield sites, as well as sort of assist with some of the risk associated with redevelopment. The program has been in place since 2006, and certainly it's been a successful program. It's also a very generous program relative to our comparators of other municipalities in the province. That being said, the program has three components. The first component is a Phase 2 environmental site assessment grant. It's matching funds for up to $40,000 for background studies associated with future remediation. There is a joint tax increment grant. Remediation costs are reimbursed to a maximum of 110% for the region's share of the TIG, so 100% direct costs, 10% soft costs. And the regional development charge exemption for brownfields, which sets the eligible remediation amount at 120%, so 100% of direct costs, 20% of soft cost or indirect costs. So as I said, it was a successful program, or it is a successful program, but it was 10 years old, and that's why we really initiated the review. It's good practice. And so one of the challenges that we found is that the funding associated with it was somewhat unpredictable. We weren't clear on the number of applications, when they would come in, the type of remediation costs associated with it, and the overall timing. And so from a budgeting perspective, it was always very challenging. So that being said, we did take a look at the program and came up with the following recommendations. One other point I think would be that when we first developed the program in 2006, there were a lot of uncertainty with respect to remediation. And while I appreciate the challenges associated with brownfield sites, the industry is certainly in a more mature state than it was previously, where achieving financing is a little bit easier. I'm not going to say it's easy. I don't want to be misquoted there, but it's certainly a little more straightforward than it was in the past. And the path towards remediation is a little more clear, although it does take time. So that being said, the recommendations with respect to the Phase 2 environmental site assessment grant is that we discontinue it. The funds were exhausted for this program in 2017, and the costs associated with this background study background studies are considered direct costs, so you can recoup those costs through other elements of the program. So that is to be discontinued. The second recommendations relate to the joint tax increment grant. And so what we're recommending is that this amount be set at 100% as opposed to 110%. So really just deal with the direct costs associated with remediation. Relative to our municipal comparators, this is still a very generous program. And it's important to note that, yes, we do run this in collaboration with our area municipalities through their community improvement plans. The third recommendation relates to the RDC bylaw. We're asking that this recommendation be approved in principle, because these recommendations will actually be dealt with directly through the review of the regional development charge and the background study. So we're not making any clear, decisive movements on this today, but it's sort of a approval in principle. It is approval in principle. And so what we're recommending here is that the eligible remediation costs be changed from 120% to 100%. So just dealing with direct costs. I'm sorry, I'm sick. That's why I sound like I can't breathe. So I apologize. And we're setting the maximum RDC limit at 100%, so that would be the cap, which has been discussed previously. And so that any of the remainder eligible costs would be recouped through the TIG program, so they do work in tandem. That being said, we're also recommending that over the life of the RDC bylaw, that there be a transition, because ultimately we're looking at phasing it out towards the end of this bylaw, so that there wouldn't be an RDC grant in the subsequent bylaw, so 5 years from now. So what we're recommending at this point as a possible transition is that essentially the first 2.5 years of the bylaw, that the eligible costs be at 100%, and then for the remainder 2.5 years of the bylaw, it would be at 50%. So that being said, we do have some. That for us, in terms of the phasing out of the brownfield, was to deal with transition, so that it provided opportunities for people who are currently in the queue or working towards remediation could transition through the program. As well, we had set with the TIG a September 1st deadline, so that if all materials were received prior to September 1st, we could then process all those applications prior to the end of the year and approve those TIGs. So again, to provide for some kind of transition. I also wanted to note that we did receive a letter from the City of Cambridge, and just for clarification purposes, they had sort of discussed the idea that this could be scoped geographically. At this point, what we're recommending is that it remain a region-wide incentive program.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. There are some maybe questions or comments, Councillor Babanovic.
Thank you very much, through you, Mr. Chair, to staff. I'm just wondering, when we looked at this program, did we develop a sense of how many potentially contaminated properties there still are in our region that I think all of us as local and regional government leaders would want to see cleaned up still?
So we do have a database that we use to assist us in terms of identifying sites that have potential contamination issues or historic land use concerns. That being said, it is very difficult to identify a specific number of sites until some of the early background studies are done, where you can confirm sort of what's on the site and whether or not it actually is a candidate brownfield site. As previously said, we do have sort of an industrial pass in the municipalities, and so there are sites that we would still want to see remediated.
Yeah, so in that regard, I mean, is it fair to say that there's still a significant number of sites that we would want to see remediated in our region?
I would say that there are definitely sites that we would want to see remediated.
So I guess when we consider that, and we consider that in relation to the kind of feedback we're hearing from the industry, where the potential cleanup of those sites is jeopardized without this kind of programming, is that not a source of concern for us?
So the intent is not to eliminate the program. We still see the merit and still believe in the goals associated with the Brownfield Financial Incentive Program. I think it's trying to balance some of the risks to the region associated with this program as well. I think also I'd point out that even with the changes that we're recommending, with respect to our municipal comparators, it's still a really fulsome program.
Well, is it in fact true that the region's been recognized by the Canadian Urban Institute and others for the fact that we actually have a model program, and that other municipalities across the country have looked to this region and its municipalities as a model program that in some cases has been replicated?
Through the chair, I can't speak directly to the Canadian Urban Institute, but I can say that through some of the Brownfields Awards, the program has been recognized as being a very fulsome program.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, at the appropriate time, I'd like to move a motion.
Okay. Councillor Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would, without having any kind of sidebar with Councillor Vanovic, we may be on the same wavelength here. I think that this is a very successful program. Obviously, it's a very successful program, and I understand staff's concern, and I thank them for trying to contain costs. But it is a very successful program, and I think that we need to have a little bit of a closer look as council at this program and at this recommendation before we make a final decision. So what I would suggest, and I don't know if this is what Councillor Vanovic was thinking or not, is that we defer or do not take no action on the report at this time and refer it to either an ad hoc committee to review it, or to the DC bylaw review committee to have a closer look at it and take into consideration the points that were raised by the delegations today.
Okay, well, we'll consider that in a moment. Councillor Jowett.
Thank you, through the chair. And so I'm sort of thinking along the same lines as Barry. So Michelle, we probably can't 100% ever quantify the level of brownfields with which are in the region. And it's probably a moving target anyway. When we, have a restoration, then we find out we get the feasibility or we get the land tested or whatever. So, well, I just wanted to sort of put it out there that I think the best thing we can do in these cases is look at that scalable sort of approach, due to the fact that the $1 million cap doesn't, seem reasonable to apply to the same size properties. But the other thing that I'm questioning is that you said that the City of Cambridge is looking to scope geographically. Can you, or sorry, they were looking to have a different incentive. Can you speak to that a little more and tell us?
So just to clarify, throughout the review, we looked at a variety of options in terms of how to address the Brownfields Financial Incentive Program. One of the ones that we had considered was to scope the program geographically. But at the end of the day, we had decided that it's a region-wide type program and best facilitates brownfields across the region. And so there seems to have been a little bit of a disconnect because I think Cambridge staff thought that we may be scoping it geographically, and I just wanted to clarify that we're not. We're still recommending it that it remain region-wide.
So I understood that much, but I guess what I'm asking is there some incentive for Cambridge to have been looking for this? Because, I understand we have we have our industrial ratios, and I always knew that Cambridge was heavy in our manufacturing. So is that one of the reasons that they were hoping that was the case? Or, I mean, I'm just putting it out there because I'm not sure.
So through the chair, I apologize, I don't have the letter here in front of me. I don't believe that was the case. That is certainly something that we can follow up with Cambridge staff to gain further input. But whether they wanted scope from a geographic perspective or not, a region-wide incentive program would cover any geography that they'd be looking for. So I think that they would be aligned.
For sure. I guess at this point, they're just looking to maybe identify, because I know in my business over the years, we knew very clearly that Cambridge had a stronger manufacturing sector for a longer time, so that would mean that there's probably the chance of more remediation necessity in that urban center, and so that's what I'm kind of looking to try and assess. Thank you.
Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Galloway. A couple of questions of clarification. One is, did you look when you were reviewing this program, Michelle, at scalability? I guess I'm going back to Councillor Jaworski's suggestion that maybe you look at a per acre or the size of the project. How was $1 million arrived at? Can you talk about sort of past practice?
Through the chair, the $1 million is basically the average remediation cost for the applications that we've received to date. We haven't had a significant number of large sites move through the program to date.
One of the questions that was asked by Mr. Robson was the actual trigger for this. Can you speak to that? Is there a specific trigger, and what is it?
Through the chair, I apologize, I don't understand trigger.
When they're deemed appropriate to receive right now the RDC and the TIG, what point of the process is this
So
granted?
through the chair, in order to receive, or what we would consider a complete application for an RDC exemption application, a record of site condition is actually required, because then we have the known costs to deal with. So we essentially know what the cost of the RDC exemption component would be. And we don't generally issue approvals until we have a concrete idea of what remediation's been carried out and the costs associated with it. And so a complete application would require that information.
One of the parts of this process that I think frustrates everybody, and I think that everybody has some sympathy for, is the fact that it's driven by the regulations of the Ministry of the Environment, and sometimes that process just seems to be extended and extended, because it seems to me that sort of prolongs this waiting period until they can actually apply for and receive it. I'm wondering if you'd comment on that.
Through the chair, the RDC process is completely within the purview of the Ministry of the Environment, or MECP. And so a lot of what we're doing are site-specific risk assessments, and there tends to be these are more complicated sites. And so there tends to be a little bit more back and forth, particularly in more recent years with MECP staff, Ministry of the Environment staff. And so we have seen a trend towards approvals from the Ministry of the Environment taking a longer amount of time.
And I think that's sort of a legitimate component that a lot of developers are facing currently. And I guess my last question is, can you talk just a little bit, and I guess I'm going back to Councillor Jowett's comment, and that's the relationship between our regional program and the fact that it's actually predicated on local tier municipalities for their community improvement plans. If you can talk about that relationship a little bit.
So the TIG component and the RDC component are a little bit different. The RDC exemption is embedded in our regional development charges bylaw, so that is a region program. And that's where we get the authority to provide for that kind of exemption. When it comes to the tax increment grant, the region can only, under the Planning Act, participate in or have its own community improvement plans for either transit or infrastructure. As a result, but we can participate in area municipal CIPs, and so the TIG is actually sheltered, for lack of a better word, in area municipal community improvement plans. So where an area municipality has a brownfields program with a TIG, we participate with them.
Thank you. I think that's an important piece to sort of add to this conversation.
Councillor Shantz.
Thank you, Chair Galloway, through you to stop. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what successful means. You've said the program's been successful, and our delegations have said the program's been successful. It's been around for 12 to 13 years, but you also said that we haven't done a significant number of large sites. So what does successful mean? And if it is successful, have we reached a point where we can say we don't need it anymore? And what does that mean?
Through the chair, so it was associated, success with respect to the review is associated with the number of applications. We had some 36 applications or sites that were approved through the program. I think some of the stats from the staff report were previously indicated in the fact that it's resulted in over 2,500 new residential units and 1 million square feet of non-res development. So in terms of the number or the amount of redevelopment that's happened through this program, it's considered very successful for the 12 years that the program has been in place. That being said, in terms of dealing with large sites, it's really about when a developer is ready or willing to bring one of those sites forward. During the life of the incentive program, we just haven't seen those coming through. We've just started to see a few of them starting to come through. That being said, I think staff are of the mind, based on the recommendations, that a financial incentive program is still important. It is still assisting with dealing with some of the risks associated with brownfield remediation. That being said, we are recommending that we can transition away from the RDC exemption component and decrease the eligible expenses associated with it.
Okay. Just a bit of a follow-up, excuse me, on that. We don't have an inventory of the number of brownfield sites that might be out there ready to be developed. I think you said that. Is there any way to sort of quantify what we are looking for, even if, if we do accept a change in how we incentivize this development? Is there any way to put some kind of a metric to it that we would know what success looks like in the future?
Through the chair, we can do some ongoing monitoring in terms of the applications that are coming forward and monitoring to see if we're having the same sort of redevelopment rates that we were previously as we move through the next RDC bylaw. That being said, I don't believe that there is a way to clearly identify or quantify the number of sites just because we don't know enough about all of the properties in the region. I indicated earlier that really you have to do some investigation to figure out exactly what's going on site to determine whether or not they are truly brownfield sites. And even within, once you do identify those, there's a spectrum of brownfield sites. So there's some that require less remediation or the contaminants are not as, clean up aren't as costly. So it would just be very challenging to identify sort of the true population of sites that would be candidates for the program.
Councillor Foxton, please.
Thank you, and through the chair, I agree with a lot of things my colleagues have brought forward, and this is a success story. It is an investment in our future as a region. And did we go into this just as a review or of the bylaw, or just because it was time to review it, or what instigated us going forward?
Through the chair, it was recommended previously that sort of at a 10-year point that we would go back and take a look at the program. It was just sort of good practice to go back and say, okay, how are things working? Are there any challenges? Can we improve the program? Do we need to adjust or change? So it was really just a best practice at the point that we entered into the review. It wasn't triggered by any one particular issue.
Okay, thank you for that. But your report does say it was a positive program. So why are we scaling it back in the way you said? And I do agree with Councillor Jaworski's suggestion.
Mr. Dyer, yeah, it's really about the cost and the unbudgeted costs and the costs coming down the pipe. It's pretty significant, and this has to be paid for.
Correct. So from a financial perspective, it's an expensive program. And it's expensive for the exact same reasons for why it's valuable to the developers. In particular, the development charge exemption component. So going back to Michelle's earlier comments, 3 components: the grant component, the RDC component, and the tax incentive component. The RDC component is valuable to developers because they get that money back up front. That makes it, by default, extremely expensive for the municipality. And that's because, under the terms of the Development Charges Act, you can't exempt a form of development and then make up for that by having a higher development charge on other forms of development. When you exempt a development from the payment of development charges, you have to fund that exemption. So to the extent that a large site is being developed and we're providing a $7 or $8 or $9 million exemption on development charges, we need to find that $7, $8, or $9 million and make the development charge reserve balances whole. So how do we do that? We do that to a small extent from operating budgets. Over time, we've done it to a great extent from taking money out of regional reserves. Roads, water, wastewater, in order to fund which are the largest components of the DC, and so that's where that funding comes from. And when we take money out of our reserves, we have less money to do our own, to fund our own capital projects. So what happens when we don't have the money to fund our own capital projects? We go and borrow for it. And as a result, our debt goes up, our debt servicing costs go up, which makes it a very expensive program.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer. So if we come back with another report on this, I'd also like to see some of those numbers of how they've impacted us and the breakdown. And as my township does, they say it cost us this, and this is where we took the money from. So I know exactly what reserves it came out of and how it impacted the rest of my budget. So I'd like that type of breakdown as well, please.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. I'm thinking about the first delegation's third ask, I think it was, although it was a long time ago now, which had to do with the notice period. You have said that the transition, the phase out that we're contemplating looks at those that are currently in the queue, but it sounds like our queue might start at a different place than the developer's queue if, in fact, some properties are owned for years and years and years before they make it to our building permit stage or whatever, environmental assessment first phase stage, whatever triggers that. So I guess I'm wondering where does the queue start from our perspective, and what potential do we have to give a longer notice period, or to take into consideration the fact that some properties may take a long time and a lot of planning before they get there?
Through the chair, we have sort of vetted the applications that we currently have, as well as the ones where we've had sort of pre-submissions with some developers. So we've been messaging the review and the potential changes for quite some time now with applicants as well as consultants, so that they were aware that this was going on. There are 2 to 3 applications that are currently in the queue for a tax increment grant. We do believe that those applications will make the September 1st deadline. That being said, the challenge with brownfields is that, their approval, particularly on the RSC side, can take a fairly long time. So there is the risk that no matter what deadline we set, there will be someone that will be just shy of getting, or could be just shy of getting their RSCs or their approvals necessary. So it will be a challenge no matter what deadline would be set. That being said, we do believe that with respect to the ones that are close and in the queue, they can be dealt with within the timeframe that we have. And the phasing out of the RDC component was meant to assist with the transition associated with those programs over that 5-year period.
Thank you.
Councillor Jowett?
Through the chair, thank you. So when I'm looking at this, Michelle, I guess we want to find a way to quantify something. It's very difficult to quantify. And so, for example, if we could look at mass inventory of land and then a ratio of remediated, because we do have those numbers, right? Perhaps that could be the metrics going forward that we continue to follow to see or quantify what we call successful. And then the other thing I'm looking at is how does our policy compare to other municipalities from a comparable position? And then, what's it cost us? And I think Mayor Foxton eloquently articulated that. And then what is the return on the investment of that particular remediation? Like, is there jobs, or did we gain property taxes, or, because I think a fulsome picture is probably warranted when we have such a strong incentive here. And so I'm not asking for you to do a ton of work, but if we at least knew how we compared to other communities from a policy standpoint, and certainly the return on investment, meaning what happened to that site after remediation. And again, a simple calculation of how much land do we have in the region, how much have we remediated. We're maybe not always going to be able to quantify what's left.
So through the chair, some of that information is available in terms of, how much the assessment was increased. It is in the staff report, and sort of the number of residential units, the square footage. So that's certainly the metrics that you're asking for in terms of ratios. We can certainly take a look at providing to you in that way. There was another question there.
So, did you want to know what this? Did you miss some part of that? Okay, and so you've got the land inventory, you've got the mass, and then of course remediated. You can give us that information, can you? Is that attainable?
Certainly, we can take a look at doing that. We certainly know the amount of land that's been through the program and what's been developed or what will be developed.
Right, and then of course, I know I hate when people ask multiple questions. Have you ever been interviewed by Greg DeRocher?
Okay, I do recall your question. Okay, with respect to our municipal counterparts, we are actually one of the only upper tier municipalities that actually participate in a brownfields program. The region of Niagara has one, and the region of Durham has a small component that they contribute, but for the most part, we are certainly the most fulsome program at an
Are
upper
we?
tier level. Yes.
Good to know. Okay, and then do we have any kind of historical data on post-remediation as to what's happened with these sites?
Through the chair, yes, that for the most part comes out through the numbers that you're seeing in the staff report.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Ivanovic?
Thank you very much, and I think a lot of good questions have been raised. I have one last one before I'd like to bring a motion forward and make some comments. And just to be clear, in terms of the projects that we've dealt with so far, the net financials of those has been a net gain. Is that correct, Mr. Dyer, for us?
Well, through you, Mr. Chair, I mean, I suppose it depends on how you do the calculation and what you include. I think we would say that the program has been successful in terms of, meeting the objectives of taking otherwise, undeveloped, contaminated sites, cleaning them up, and developing and developing those sites. So I think, certainly that's successful. In terms of net financial gain, I guess I can give that a little bit more thought in terms of how we would measure that, both in terms of, the cost to the region versus the future assessment growth and taxes generated from that property. So, we could look into potentially doing that kind of calculation. Hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, what I would suspect is that we are better off financially today with those properties being cleaned up and generating significant tax dollars for us than we would have been if they continued to sit dormant and contaminated in our community. Not to mention the environmental and sustainability and quality of life gain that exists. Is that a fair assumption?
I'm not sure I'm in a position to speak to the quality of life piece. I can certainly speak to the tax piece, though, and without putting too fine a point on it, we would say that the development of an otherwise unused property creates assessment growth. It doesn't create tax revenue. It creates assessment growth. It creates a larger base over which the region and the local municipality assess their annual property tax levy. And we can look at, we can look at trying to find some measure of that to help explain to members of council the success of the program and the costs of the program over the last 12 years.
Okay, so right in the report, you reference that on average assessment values across these sites is estimated to be more than 3,000% higher than remediation rather. So, I get there's a difference between assessment and taxes, but at the end of the day, that increased assessment is generating additional revenue for us as regional and local governments, correct?
Yes, there's no question that those properties have a higher assessment post-development than before that. And in some cases, for a period of time, that additional assessment is used to pay for the remediation costs through the TIG. And after the point that the remediation costs are paid off, then yes, it's assessment that's available for to spread the regional and local tier levy over which in each year.
Right, okay. So, Mr. Chair, I don't know, is there any more questions, or is this the time to bring a motion forward?
No more questions.
So, Mr. Chair, what I'd like to do is move a motion of no action today and refer this issue to Budget 2020. That I believe we have a reserve fund already in place, but we look at what the appropriate reserve fund amounts should be in order to help even out the costs that we're talking about. I know the suggestion was made about potentially referring it to the RDC discussion. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done here that, quite frankly, I think that's too quick. But more importantly, referring it to the RDC discussion really takes it out of council's hands until the very end. And by the time the RDC will come to us, it's going to be pretty difficult to start changing things without jeopardizing ultimately the timing of it. So I think the right place to deal with it is through the budget. I realize that would mean that there would be no changes in this RDC, and that's something I'm prepared for as we look at this issue. I think what we need to do, Mr. Chair, is consider the fact that in an era of increased focus on sustainability and increased investments in the environment by all levels of government, the time to be stepping away from a program like this is not now. I think as a region, we have a proud history of not looking at just what is the right decision today, but what is the right decision for future generations. And my thinking is that as long as we even have one contaminated site still left in this region, and there's far more than one left in this region, a program like this is necessary so that we clean up these sites for the benefit of future generations in this community. We're only going to grow, and we're going to grow through intensification. And to not see these sites cleaned up, and I can think of many in Kitchener, I can think of some in Waterloo and Cambridge and even the townships. And I'm sure that's only a small percentage of what actually exists. And so I think we need to continue building on what has been our model history of doing the right thing on these kinds of things. As I've mentioned, we've won awards for our program through Canadian Urban Institute and their Brownie Awards. We've won an award more recently, for example, on a particular project. Jointly, it was a joint award to Perimeter and the region on Bright Up Block. We've had staff from this region speaking at conferences about our programs and other municipalities that, quite frankly, have looked at us in this regard. And so I think, I appreciate the fact, as Councillor Strickland said, that a review has happened, that staff have looked at this issue from a financial point of view. But at the end of the day, the real gain will come when we see all these properties cleaned up. And in the meantime, these investments, I think, are necessary, or otherwise we're just going to see these properties continue to sit there for who knows how many more decades.
Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Galloway. I'm going to ask for a little bit of clarification because it seems to me that this is a prudent review, and I'm not taking away any of the merits of the actual program. I don't think anybody's debating that. Nobody's suggesting that it end. But there are actually two components to this. One is the RDC exemption, and the other is the TIG. And it's a much longer, and it sort of pays for itself. And I know when I was at Habitat, we looked at this, and it really did incentivize going to look at contaminated sites. And sometimes you don't understand that until you've done the record of site condition. And I understand that there are a lot of moving parts to this. But I'd also ask staff just to comment on the fact that we are going through an RDC review, and that too needs some debate and probably will be somewhat contentious. But I believe that that's a 5-year review. So I'm a bit concerned with Councillor Vrbanovich's suggestion that we do nothing till a budget cycle when I see there's an RDC component that will by then, I think, already have been decided, and that will be for the next 5 years. So it seems to me we may be taking away one of the considerations of this TIG and RDC exemption through timing.
Mr. Dyer.
So through Mr. Chair, a couple of comments. With respect to the RDC piece, yes, we're going through the bylaw review right now. Our current bylaw expires on July 31st. And as you're aware, RDC bylaws have a maximum 5-year life. I suppose the concern I would have about deferring discussion on the RDC component until a 2020 budget is that any changes to the RDC component then would, just thinking this through, would require an amendment to the RDC bylaw. So we would have to go through a background study, public process, everything we would normally do on a once every 5-year term, we would have to do if the brownfield component of the, if the RDC component of the brownfield program was to be changed after the bylaw was put in place on August 1st. I would say that's probably my main concern right now.
Okay, Councillor Strickland?
Mr. Murray wanted to comment?
Mr. Murray?
Yeah, if I could just reinforce what Craig is saying, you know, I think certainly the RDC steering committee is aware, you know, we're working through the RDC review process, the background study, and I think we've identified, you know, a small handful of legitimate policy issues that need to be considered in this development charge bylaw review. And so I think that this, you know, brownfield DC exemption is one of those legitimate issues that, you know, is on the table, needs to be on the table, needs to be considered. It needs to be considered in the context of other DC exemptions that might be considered for a bylaw. For instance, core area exemptions, that's a legitimate issue that the steering committee is turning its mind to. So I think the steering committee and council need to consider this range of issues. Core area exemptions, brownfield exemptions. Are there other exemptions that one or, you know, other stakeholder groups might want to propose? And this range of exemptions needs to be considered together, because together they have financial implications for the region. So I think it would be actually a really missed opportunity if we're only considering some elements of the bylaw, some exemptions, and not even exploring, do we continue with other exemptions? So I think inevitably it needs to and is going to be considered as part of the bylaw review.
And if I may, just a concluding comment, page 14 of staff report does look at the 10-year capital budget forecast, and I think people in the community often don't recognize that when we give RDC exemptions, we actually fund those long-term through our budget process. And that's a consideration and a decision that's totally appropriate for council to make, but you have to recognize that that means it makes other decisions more difficult. It makes incurring other debt for worthwhile projects, maybe takes them off the table. So it's not that this council can't make those decisions, it's just that they do have long-term budgetary impacts for the future.
Councillor Foxton?
Thank you, and through the chair. I think we do.
I'm sorry. There was actually, it was Councillor Strickland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, Sean.
We went to Mr. Murray.
I really wanted to hear what Councillor Foxton had to say, but it was my turn. I really appreciate where Councillor Vanovic is coming from, and I think that it's fair to say, from based on the discussion around the horseshoe today, that most of us share those concerns about possible changes to this program, how it might negatively impact our ability and the developer's ability to develop brownfield sites. I think part of the issue is, for me anyways, I don't really know the scope of, you know, how many brownfields are out there, what's the financial risk, what's the financial reward. These are questions that I think need to be answered. And my concern with Councillor Banovic's motion, even though I support the principle of it, is, as Mr. Dyer had mentioned, that the bylaw review is every 5 years. So these changes we make here are impacted and related to our bylaw review. So it seems natural for me to defer this to the DC bylaw review committee, have them review it. And I'd also like to add that there is a public meeting component to the bylaw review. So when the bylaw is made in its first draft, we have a public meeting. And I think there's also an opportunity to present to council. So easily could divide that public meeting up into these policy issues. We have, we can have a section on the bylaw review itself, then on TIGs, on downtown exemptions. So these policy issues could be given further review and deeper analysis through council and also with the public. So I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that I would move a motion to defer. And I don't know procedurally if you want me to defer Councillor Vrbanovic's motion or deal with that and then just defer the report to the DC Bylaw Review Committee.
Councillor Foxton, I've already recognized Councillor
That's
Foxton.
fair enough, yeah.
Actually, Councillor Strickland said what I was going to say so much better than I would have said it, so thank you kindly. I do think we need the full picture. I don't think we have the full picture. We need to know what's outstanding. We need to know how it impacts our existing funds. We need to know what future revenue it could bring in. We need the whole picture, but we also have to do it with the upcoming bylaw, as Mr. Dyer said. So I have to agree. Thank you, Councillor Strickland.
Okay, Councillor, the motion to defer takes precedence. So is there a seconder for the motion to defer? Well, then we got to talk time and place. Councillor Vrbanovic's motion, is that what we're deferring? Or are we deferring? No, we're deferring the matter, as Councillor Strickland has indicated, so that the RDC task force can take on the responsibility to look at that element of it. I suspect that that's the information that the task force will want, yeah. So is there a motion, a seconder on the deferral? Councillor Foxton? Okay, so Councillor Vrbanovic, I'll let you talk to that.
Well, thank you. And I certainly, based on the mood in the room, am open to the notion of deferring it to the RDC discussion. But I think it's really imperative that if that's going to happen, we have an opportunity to have a meaningful dialogue, and that all of the work on the RDCs isn't done by the working group, and it basically comes around this horseshoe, looking for the rest of us to sort of rubber stamp a done deal. Because I think we need to. I think we need to make sure, because this is a fundamental policy issue that I think we're going to need to have a lot more debate on, based on having the additional information that people are looking for. And from my personal perspective, this is an area where, quite frankly, I'm prepared to not see changes in the RDC bylaw for another 5 years, because I think there's a lot more work to be done. But if we're going to have that debate between now and June again, I'm happy to wait until then. But hopefully that other information will be there, and it won't be at a stage where it becomes, very difficult to not see it included, if that's the will of what ultimately this council is.
Okay. Any other debate on the deferral? All in favor? Opposed? It's carried. Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, we have no further delegations, so we'll go back to the consent agenda. Is there any items on the consent agenda that you would like to speak to specifically? Councillor Rentz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just briefly on the automated speed enforcement update, I'm wondering if we could just hear from staff very briefly on where we're at with that. And I think this is a great initiative, and I guess I'm concerned that we have huge issues on regional roads right now, and we're trying to accommodate everybody. So I'm just would like an update. I wonder if Mr. Henderson could just very briefly tell us where we're at and where we want to go with this.
Mr. Vanderkeer.
Through you, Mr. Chair, staff is working with the partnering municipalities as part of the Automated Speed Enforcement Working Group, or the committee, that is formed as a subset of the Ontario Traffic Council, which has police involved as well. So the City of Toronto is pushing to release a request for proposal this spring, and staff and the committee are working with that group to finalize the details of that request for proposal to procure a vendor that would supply and maintain an automated speed enforcement system. There's still some questions that need to be answered in terms of exactly how the system would operate and the locations and so on, and staff continue to work with the area municipalities through the Traffic Coordinating Committee and through the Ontario Traffic Council on getting those details sorted out. And we hope to come back to Council with a lot more information and a recommendation when that request for proposal comes back with the results of that tender.
So when you say Toronto and Waterloo region, it's like apples and oranges in my mind, but is this a regional initiative, so the region will be managing this eventually? Or is it the individual municipalities, or is it regional police?
Just want to make sure everybody's aware that this is not approved yet. Council has not approved this. This is just staff doing their due diligence. It'll come at some point in time for implementation if in fact we want to implement it.
Well, if that was for my benefit, I already know that, Mr. Chair, but I would like an answer to my question.
Well, you're making it sound as if when we do
Are we any
this,
closer? Do we know? Is it just going to be regional roads, or is it going to be every school site, or what is the thinking?
Through you, Mr. Chair, the regulation allows automated speed enforcement on any municipal road within a school zone or within a community safety zone as designated by bylaw. So those could occur on area municipality roads as well as regional roads. So staff are working with area municipality staff on looking at a model in terms of how it would be managed. There's a couple of options shown in the report.
Saw that.
Whereas the region would manage all locations, whether they are on a regional road or an area municipality road, or each area municipality also has the option to opt into the group acquirement on their own. And they can be a partnering municipality with the other 11 or so that are currently partnering, including the City of Toronto, to procure the vendor.
And when is this coming back?
We would hope to bring something back once the RFP has been received from the City of Toronto, hopefully before the summer break, but it could be after, because we're still working on the draft of the RFP with the partnering municipalities.
So this was approved in 2017, and we're in 2019, and we really haven't moved very much on it, right?
Through you, Mr. Chair, there's been a lot of work done to date to get to where we are. It's a complicated issue, as it was when it was introduced many years ago.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Okay, any other matters on the consent agenda? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda. Councillor Kiefer, Councillor Armstrong, all in favor? It's carried. We will move then to the regular agenda. The first item is done. The next item is the development approach for the King Victoria Transit Hub. Move that. There's no presentation, just questions. Moved by Councillor Strickland, seconded by Councillor Rentz. Any questions? All in favor? That's carried. The monitoring change in the Central Transit Corridor, we do have a presentation. So Margaret Bacon's going to do that. It starts on page 131. Morning, Margaret.
Good morning, Chair Galloway, members of council. Each year, the Planning Research and Analytics Group produces a report to show change in the Central Transit Corridor. We monitor 13 different indicators that show not only how people are moving in the corridor, but also how community around ION is changing. We track the positive changes that ION is intended to achieve, and we monitor the aspects of community that are also important to preserve. This report is our fourth monitoring report and updates the indicators to the end of year 2017. The Central Transit Corridor is the area within approximately 800 meters of ION rapid transit stops and the lands that connect these to form a continuous corridor. The 800-meter distance is generally accepted as the distance that people will walk in about 10 minutes to access rapid transit. The CTC connects the urban centers of downtown Galt, downtown Kitchener, and uptown Waterloo. The geography of the CTC includes areas within the corridor that are expected to re-urbanize over time. Each year, we update the annual indicators. In 2017, we saw transit ridership was stable, and there was increased walking and cycling within the corridor. Air emissions per capita from passenger vehicles grew as car ownership continued to increase. We also saw improved vibrancy through more people, 11,000 more people since 2011, more restaurants, and a stable perception of safety. We also note that heritage retention was under pressure as development continued. Investment has continued to climb. There was $2.3 billion in building permits for new construction since 2011, and a $4.7 billion increase in the assessed value of properties within the corridor. Each year, we also do a deeper dive on a particular theme. Last year, we looked at investment in the corridor. This year, together with our colleagues in housing, we examine questions about the changing of affordability of housing within the corridor. But first, to put this work into context, it is important to recognize that 2017 was the peak of the housing market in Waterloo region, as shown in this graph from our local real estate board. So we can see that the peak of the housing market was in April of 2017, and at that time, average condo apartment increased from $200,000 to $275,000. Average rent in 2018 was 5.7% higher than the previous year, even while vacancy was at a healthy 2.9%. Several indicators were developed to illustrate home affordability within the corridor. So this report finds that for home buyers, a third of resale housing transactions were considered to be affordable for low and medium income earners in 2017. Outside the corridor, home ownership affordability was lower at 1 in 6. So remembering again that 2017 was the peak of the housing market. And for those in the rental market, the indicator found that 61% of renters were paying what is considered to be an affordable rent, which is similar to the 69% outside the corridor. So looking at these indicators over time, since ION was announced in 2011, we found that the amount of housing that was considered affordable for owners and renters remained stable in the corridor until 2016, when the average housing prices began to increase both inside the corridor as well as across the region. To understand the implications of this, we also considered further questions. Is gentrification happening, and are people being pushed out of the corridor? This has been a topic on the minds of the public, the media, elected officials, and academia. So is gentrification happening? We do know that average rents are higher, as much as 40% higher over 5 years in specific areas of the corridor, and that this is seen as a sign of gentrification. This is not an indication that people who are living in the corridor are experiencing these rising rents and incomes, but that there are new residents that are moving into the corridor that are raising those averages. The question with respect to gentrification then is, are people getting pushed out of the corridor? And across the corridor, our indicators did not show measurable signs of displacement. We measured displacement, or people getting pushed out of the corridor, in two ways. First, we looked at the number of region-funded community housing units and found that those have remained stable over time. In 2017, that number was sitting at 2,645 units. This indicates that there has not been a loss of affordable housing units within the corridor, despite those increased housing market pressures. Further, we looked at those receiving housing allowances to rent at market rates through a program called HAWS. My colleagues in housing will know that this is the Housing Allowance with Supports program. And we found that 57% of those under this program were able to find housing within the corridor, and this rate has remained stable since the program was initiated in 2015. The significance of this indicator is that the people who participate in this program are considered to be those that are most vulnerable to homelessness, and that they are seemingly able to find housing within the allowance that they're provided within the corridor over time. In summary, we're finding that there are early signs of gentrification within the CTC corridor. New residents are being attracted to the ION corridor, as we're seeing in increased average rents and incomes. However, at the same time, thousands of new units are coming onto the market, which we believe is minimizing the displacement of current residents. However, to ensure that affordable housing options remain available in the corridor, we recommend ongoing research, monitoring, programs, and policy review to be important. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Maybe before we got one question, but could you redefine again gentrification? Because I found that, very helpful when you briefed me and Councillor Clark on this report, because I think the media and even ourselves, even myself, had a different understanding of what gentrification is, and you explained it. So I think it's important to understand it. I think many of us thought, well, it's affordable housing is disappearing, and there may be some early signs of that, but that's not exactly what gentrification is. So maybe you could just go over that again.
Sure. I think gentrification is really a broader set of issues and circumstances that we see. So gentrification is typically seen as a group of people move into an area and typically change how that area looks. The negative aspect of gentrification that many people focus on or concerned about is the displacement of existing residents from that area. So if we get a little bit technical about the displacement aspect of it, we can see displacement if ION were to cause the demolition of homes, for example. That would be a direct form of displacement. If we were to see changes in policy that push people out of an area, that would be an indirect form of displacement. And what we were trying to measure with this, and I think what a lot of people are interested in, is a broader form of displacement that can happen through financial pressures as housing prices may rise in an area and people may find it difficult to remain in that area. And so the indicators that we were looking at in order to understand whether this displacement was happening were the two indicators that we described, and with each of those we did not detect people being pushed out of the corridor at this point in time.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair Galloway. I have a question, really, just out of curiosity, and then a comment. My question is, why do we look at restaurants? Why do we look at grocery stores or shoe stores? Is that a standard measure? Is there some significance to restaurants?
Restaurants we use as an indicator of vitality within the corridor. They are important to have in a community in order to provide for that type of entertainment. There are pragmatic reasons that we measure restaurants because we have a data set that is good and stable and allows us to be able to measure restaurants over time. I heard a presentation from Australia where they were measuring the number of cafes, outdoor cafes, in order to measure vitality. So there's no sort of single indicator that's broadly accepted, but it is a useful indicator. Yeah.
Thank you. Now my comment, I did share this when we spoke earlier. I think that it's good news that we're not actively expelling people who live in low income from the core, but I think we're setting the bar pretty low for ourselves if we say that's a goal. I see Mr. Schumacher here, and I learned from him yesterday that we're now at 4,600 households on the wait list for community housing. I think I'm right. You can correct me if I'm not. We said 4,000 last year. We said 3,500 the year before that. If we're not creating new affordable housing in the core, and I mean sustainable, I don't mean HAWS, I mean sustainable units, then we are effectively creating an exclusive core that is preventing people from living there. Just a statement.
Okay. Chair Redmond?
Thank you. This is very interesting in really highlighting the changes that the ION's impacting on our community. Is affordability 30% of people's income? Is that how we define affordability?
So there are different indicators for rental versus for home ownership. For home ownership, that is basically the way of measuring it. With rental, it's a bit more complex. There's a few different ways to do it, but for the rental, we look at low and moderate income households, so those in the lower earning bracket. And again, they should be spending less than 30% of their income on affordability. They may be choosing to spend more than that to have a nicer home to rent in, but that's what the bar is set at in terms of defining affordability.
Thank you.
Okay, no further questions. Thanks, Margaret. The next item is the Airport Master Plan Steering Committee, Implementation Steering Committee. The recommendation is there to constitute an ongoing implementation steering committee that would be made up of a variety of individuals as recommended, along with the regional chair and 4 regional councillors. Are there any questions or comments in that regard, or does someone want to move the recommendation? Councillor Schatz, Councillor Foxton, all in favor, or do you want to speak to it first? Yeah, okay. Councillor Lawrence, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm just trying to kind of understand this a little bit. We're going to have 7 staff people on there and 5 elected officials. And what exactly are we doing again? Because my understanding was with the master plan, it's basically based on benchmarks. We hit a certain benchmark, we move on to the next stage. We hit another benchmark, we move on to the next stage. So I read this and I still don't really understand with the state of the airport today where we're going with this.
Okay. Mr. Rozier?
Yeah, through you, Chair Galloway. Council will recall that when we approved the master plan back in March of 2017, we approved essentially the implementation of the first stage of the master plan. And as Councillor Lorenz has said, we will move forward through a variety of additional stages, provided that we hit some passenger trigger numbers over the next 5 to 10 years. The stage that we're at right now is to do the detailed planning work that's required for us to actually implement stage 2, so that when we hit the trigger of approximately 250,000 passengers, we're actually ready to do the capital works required to support our growth over the next period of time. So Council had approved a proposal, an RFP last year to initiate this detailed planning work. It's looking at the environmental assessment and design work for runway extensions. It's looking at terminal building options, feasibility for expansion of the existing terminal building, as well as alternative locations. It's asking questions around the feasibility and location of potential third runway if necessary in the long run. And there are one or two other items that we're studying. We have a consulting team engaged as per the decision last year. We'd like to have some ongoing discussion and support with a steering committee from council and senior staff about the direction that we're moving in. So it's a more detailed planning process than we were engaged in with the master plan.
Well, Mr. Chair, I guess there's a couple analogies. One would be, it seems like we're putting the cart before the horse, but, you know, I think we need to increase activity out there before we even consider moving forward. I mean, everybody talks about the phrase, build it and they will come, but we've built it and nobody's come. So until we see some actual increase in flights, I'm just a little concerned that we're moving ahead on this without that activity.
Mr. Murray?
Yeah, if I could just add, when council approved the master plan, you know, one of the immediate next steps was to embark on the planning studies that Mr. Regier talked about. So that work is underway, and council approved last year engaging a consulting team to do that work. So the work is underway so that when we hit those passenger thresholds, we're ready to move quickly, because the work that's going on now, you know, is going to take 12 to 18 months. So rather than wait and then have to start into the planning studies at that point, council did say, yes, let's undertake the planning studies now. So that work is underway. We've got a consulting team on board. And what's become apparent is, as we work through that, a lot of issues come up, and we think it would be helpful to have a steering committee of council to, you know, be a sounding board, provide ongoing input and advice and guidance as we work through the planning work, just as we're doing on a number of other big projects. The multimodal hub is one, rapid transit is another, RDC steering committee is another. So staff's view is the work would benefit from a steering committee of council. We think about 5 councillors would be about the right size. And so we're hoping that council will strike that, and we're hoping that some councillors will volunteer to participate.
Councillor Strickland?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share some of the concerns that Councillor Rentz has. Like, we put into place a master plan, and you know, given the examples that Mr. Murray just shared about how we, you know, King Victoria Transit Hub, et cetera, I don't think you're comparing apples to apples. We have a master plan in place. Typically, we put master plans in place, GRT business plan, for example, and master plans put in place, and then staff implement the master plan, reports come back to council. So I don't quite understand why we have a master plan in place for the airport. And, you know, we've approved a consultant, and now we have to have another steering committee. So my concern is that, you know, what is the responsibility of the steering committee? Are they going to see reports before they come to this committee and to council? Are they going to approve things for the airport without the benefit of the entire council having a look at them? You know, the airport's a fairly politically sensitive service that we provide, and I'm not entirely comfortable with this creation of a steering committee. We have a master plan in place. Implement the master plan. The reports need to come back to committee. Have the reports come back to committee, and we deal with them as a council.
Councillor Foxton?
Thank you, Chair. When we went to Queen's Park, we spoke about the airport, and I believe we also at Ottawa. What we're preparing the upper levels of government for is granting for this next phase. Now, the 250,000, I thought it was 280,000 threshold was passengers, was when we have to start to implement the next phase, which means we have to be ready for it. We're not there. I believe we're at 80,000 passengers a year. And so this was all in the report. This is all way pre-planning. But you have to start it now, because it was funny, because one of the retorts coming back to me was that in 2031, and Councillor McGeary and Councillor Shantz refreshed my mind, somebody, Wellington said that we will have 7 million passengers. And I said, I questioned their figures, and they said, well, a report was sent out. And with Toronto sending passengers this way, and of course I refuted that report, but it says that this is a long process. And we start the rough planning now. The master plan was the groundwork for the next phases. And the background studies, as you know, take so long and everything else. So I don't disagree that we shouldn't start this now. Do we need 5 counselors right away? Do we need this much of a staff right away? Or maybe we bump it up as we're getting closer to the targets. But I figure we're laying groundwork for the next 10 years.
Okay, no further questions. There's 2 issues here. One is the actual moving forward of the master plan. I don't think that should be in debate because we've already approved the master plan. And the master plan indeed requires or suggests that we do this planning ahead of the next trigger, so that when that trigger is reached, then we have whatever it is in place. We don't have to take another year to do that planning. So I don't know if that's in question. I think what's in question is what is the need for this particular steering committee. There has to be some oversight by somebody, whether it's a single staff person or whether it's a group of staff people, and whether or not there needs to be elected representation on that. And staff are recommending that that be the case. So, I mean, you can choose one way or the other, and if you don't think it's necessary, then you don't support this this recommendation. But I don't think there should be any question that we're doing this work. I mean, indeed, we've hired the consultant, and it is in the master plan to do so, and to get the plans in place. So if and when the next trigger gets hit, then, you know, if we have to build something or do something, we don't have to wait 6 or 9 or 12 months to get that work done. So I think the question is fairly straightforward, and that is staff are recommending that there be such a steering committee and that there be 5 members of council, the regional chair and 4 regional councillors involved in that. And if somebody wants to move that, then we can have a vote on it, and some may not think it's necessary and some might. Councillor Jowett. Or you'll move it? Councillor Strickland, you want to speak?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. You know, I don't recall anyone speaking against the approval of the consultant. I think we all agree that we need to do some planning as...
No, I think Councillor Rentz was questioning why we were moving ahead on any kind of planning.
Well, yeah, fine, but I'm saying that you know, well, Councillor Rentz have said that, and I think to a certain degree that may be an issue because we are talking about, you know, a trigger at 250,000 passengers when we currently had, what, 47,000 last year? But anyways, that's another debate. But we supported the hiring of a consultant. I supported the master plan, and I also supported the hiring of the consultant when that recommendation came forward. I'm really concerned about governance and the creation of a steering committee. It's a separate committee. We don't have that contemplated. We talked about a separate operating committee for the airport and a different governance structure. So I'm really concerned about creating a separate committee to look after the airport and deal with issues that I think should properly dealt with by this body as we normally do with all the master plans we put in place. There's no steering committee in place to oversee staff on the implementation of the GRT business plan. There's no committee for the heritage plan, you know, so I just don't like this at all, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a question of process and governance, and I'm not going to support the creation of the steering committee.
Okay. So it's been moved by our Councillor Lawrence. You want to speak?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Councillor Strickland. I think we may be just premature on this, and I didn't have the benefit of going down to Queen's Park or hearing that Toronto was sending passengers our way, because I don't think the numbers speak to that. And if they are flying, I'd like to know what airlines they're flying on. But this may be premature. That's my thinking. We don't have other steering committees to run different master plans. And I guess I'm just concerned that we're going to have a committee that's going to be making decisions on behalf of this council. And I think at some point this may be needed, but I don't think it's today. And I think if there's reports that come back that need action, that this council should look at those reports and make those decisions, not just 4 or 5 people.
Okay, so I'd like to get the motion on the floor.
Sure, I'd ask for a recorded vote as well.
We have someone to move it. Is there someone to second? I just want a seconder right now. I've got you. Okay, seconded by Councillor Banovic. Councillor Fox.
Can I have clarification? Was this committee set up to be a separate committee unto itself, not report back to council? Because then I made the wrong assumption.
Well, just to provide a little bit of context, we have steering committees on a number of other major initiatives. And so staff's view was staff benefit from those steering committees and the opportunity for, to have a sounding board, to have some group provide early advice as we're working through issues. The steering committees typically do not have a decision-making role. If I think about Multimodal Hub Steering Committee or Rapid Transit Steering Committee, all those decisions come to council. But I would say the staff benefit from sort of that early discussion on key issues. And there's, going to be a number of key issues that we work through with these planning studies. Potential optional locations for an airport terminal building, the planning study for a potential third runway. Like, there's some big, interesting issues that, frankly would benefit from a little bit of input and sounding board as we're working through them. So that was staff's view, but and the steering committee would not have a decision-making role. All decisions would come to council. So, we're in council's hands. If you want to strike steering committee, great. If you don't, that's fine. Staff will continue to do the work we're doing.
Okay, so just to clarify, it is still reporting to council. Council makes all the decisions. Thank you.
Chair Redmond.
Thank you, Chair Gallo. I was just going to make the observation that we dealt with the brownfield incentive and sort of sent it to a committee to have a deeper dive. And one of the reasons why the airport was brought up both in Ottawa and Queen's Park was the fact that we do need partnership with other levels of government. And we do need to figure out what we're going to make that ask look like. The GTAA has already publicly stated that it's looking to our airport, Hamilton's and London's, as a way to offload and have a more comprehensive long-term plan. So I think it does make sense that there is a deeper dive. Clearly, it would always come back to council, and it very much in the spirit of we wanted more information and a deeper dive on the brownfield incentives. That would be the kind of thing I would hope an advisory committee would say, this is what we think council needs, but it would always be council's final decision, and this is a decision-making body, not an advisory committee.
Councillor Vanovic.
Well, thank you, and I think some of the points I was going to make have been made. In particular, we have actually a ton of working groups. We have the RDC working group. We have the one that looks after the LRT project. We have the one that's looking after the transit hub, and then tons of project teams beyond that. So it's not a model that's uncommon to us. I think maybe what we're hearing from Councillors Strickland and Lawrence is maybe something that we need to think about in terms of, that broader list of working groups is making sure that the work of those working groups comes back to committee and council in a manner at a time where the full council feels they have an opportunity to duly consider the work of the working group, but also provide meaningful input that can still change outcomes and not complicate things necessarily. I think that's maybe some of the frustrations we're hearing in this discussion and the earlier ones. But I certainly am supportive of creating the airport working group in this one.
Councillor Shantz.
Thank you. Similar to Councillor Verbanovic, you know, there's five major studies that are listed here that are going ahead as part of the master plan, and I think having some input from a steering committee is quite okay. I also see those things coming back to council. That's the way we do business here, so I don't see a problem with that, and I'd be happy to volunteer for that steering committee if it's so approved.
Councillor
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question of understanding the history of it. So this steering committee, how would this be different than the report we just approved for the transit hub? That group met. Are we basically talking the same thing here?
Mr. Murray?
Yeah, so I actually think the Transit Hub's a good example. We have a steering committee that's, working with staff on the Transit Hub project. So that steering committee has been engaged in lots of discussions, deeper dive on some issues, advice to staff as we've worked through some issues, requests to staff saying, when council considers this for decision, here's some key questions that council's going to want to ask. And so staff, please do this work in advance. So that's the kinds of discussions that have happened at the Multimodal Hub Steering Committee. And then that resulted in, a report that came to council today because this was a decision-making milestone that's in council's purview based on, discussions that have happened at the steering committee. So, we would see the Airport Master Plan Implementation Steering Committee working in much the same way. Informing the work that goes on and then coming to council at key milestones for key decisions.
Councillor Strickland.
The difference I would say is that there's a master plan for the airport. There's no master plan for the Canadian Victoria Transit Hub. So the Canadian Victoria Transit Hub Committee was more of an iterative process as we went along and explored different options. It's already a plan in place at the airport.
Okay, I'll call the question then. All in favor? All recorded vote? Okay, hang on.
The plus will go green. Just a second, I'm just gonna. Plus is yes, Mike.
Why are we doing
Light
this?
up
What's
colors.
this for?
Mr. Chairman, don't we need to appoint doesn't the recommendation indicate we need to appoint the councillors?
It's not part of the recommendation. We'll ask for volunteers, I guess. Okay, ready?
Start vote.
Okay, that's approved. Okay. Volunteers, so Councillor Shantz should be there. Sure. Councillor Jowett, you wish to be there? I would like to be there. Councillor Urbanovic, Councillor Harris, that's, is that, and so that,
No, it's 5.
That's 5. Yeah.
How about the whole committee and reports come back to case?
Yeah. They will come back to here. Okay. All right, we'll move on to the next item. That's the Grand River Transit Preferred 2019 PICs. Any questions in that regard? Let me get me back my screen. Okay, that's for information. And then the next item is the wastewater operations and maintenance contract negotiations with Aqua. Any questions? Looking at the likely renegotiation of that contract. Chair Redmond?
I just should have identified, my son-in-law works for Aqua, so I would not be voting or discussing this.
Okay, so noted. No other questions on that? Then the drinking water summary report, system review and infrastructure maintenance plan. There is a recommendation with this particular report. Moved by Councillor Rentz, seconded by Councillor Foxton. All in favor? It's carried. And are there any other matters to bring to the meeting? Councillor Strickland.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I was wondering about schedule, seeing as we're behind.
Right.
And we're scheduled to go into closed committee, but would it make sense to go right into A&F and have closed afterwards? I'm not sure if there's anything in closed that will need to come out afterwards based on a quick review.
Can staff advise on that? Does the close have to go ahead of A&F? There is a delegation here already, I believe, for
Yeah.
A&F.
Yeah.
One item in clause that needed to be dealt with ahead of A&F open. But I would suggest you could hear the delegation first, and then we can go to close.
It's not related to that item. Okay. So we could do that. Although I think we have to also take a break at this time.
We do, yeah.
Because media wants to do some interviews. Okay, so does that work then, Councillor Strickland?
Sure.
Okay.
So we're going to recess now for 10 minutes,
We're
hear
gonna
delegation, then go into
recess
closed.
And then do A&F delegation, and then go down to close. Yeah.
All right.
Motion to adjourn. Councillor Foxton, Councillor Shantz, all in favor? Carried. Thank you.